somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, long before the Parthenon was built, long before Socrates asked his questions in the Agora, long before anyone had heard of Athens or Sparta, there was a civilization sailing these waters with a confidence that suggests they had been doing it for generations. They built palaces without walls. They painted dolphins on the ceilings of their rooms. They traded with Egypt and Syria and the distant islands of the Cyclades. And they did all of this so far back in time that by the classical Greek period, they were mostly just a memory, a whisper in myth, a shadow underneath the foundations of everything that came after. Most people, when they think about ancient Mediterranean civilization, think about Greece, the columns, the philosophy, the democracy, the wine-dark sea of Homer. But there was a world before that world, a world that was already sophisticated, already maritime, already deeply connected across water in ways that shaped everything the Greeks would later become. And understanding the earlier world means looking at a sea that was in some ways more central to human life than it is today. Welcome to Legacy of Throne. Before we begin, drop your current city or country in the comments right now, along with your local time. Whether you are watching from Sydney or Tokyo, from Washington or Warsaw, from Toronto or London, tell us you are here. We read every single comment and love knowing where the Legacy of Throne community gathers. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell and let this extraordinary journey begins. The Aegean is not like other bodies of water. It's not the vast open emptiness of the Pacific, not the stormy grey of the North Atlantic. The Aegean is intimate. It's scattered with islands the way a table might be scattered with stones, hundreds of them, close enough that on a clear day you can often see the next one from the shore of the last. For ancient sailors, this was not a barrier, but a highway. You could move from island to island in small increments, reading the currents, reading the winds, learning the hidden coves where fresh water could be found, and where a boat could rest safely through the night. A civilization that understood this sea didn't just have access to trade routes, it had access to everything. And somewhere in the middle of all this, anchoring the southern edge of the Ion, like a long green ship itself, sits. It's the largest island in the Greek world, and in terms of what it may have meant to the ancient Mediterranean, possibly the most important island that most people have never spent enough time thinking about. Because on Crete, something extraordinary happened. A civilization rose that modern archaeologists have called Minoan, a name borrowed from the mythological king Minos. And though the myth and the reality are not the same thing, they point in the same direction, toward a society that was wealthy, organized, deeply connected to the sea, and sophisticated, enough to have built multi-story palace complexes with indoor plumbing and frescoed walls at a time when much of Europe was still operating at a level we might charitably call prehistoric. Now, calling the Minoans a sea empire is the kind of phrase that needs a little handling. We don't have their written history. They left no inscriptions in a language we can fully read. There was no Minoan Herodotus sitting down to explain their world to future generations. What we have is archaeology. And archaeology is a language of objects and spaces and soil layers. It tells you things, but it tells them slowly and with a certain built-in ambiguity. What we can say with real confidence is that Minoan Crete appears to have been a remarkably powerful and far-reaching presence in the Bronze Age Aegean, and that its influence extended to islands and coastlines well beyond Crete itself. Whether you call that a trade network, or a political empire, or something in between, probably depends on who you ask and what evidence they're weighing. The honest answer is, it was probably all of those things at different times and in different places. What's harder to argue with is the sheer improbability of it. Here is a civilization on a Mediterranean island, building palaces with sophisticated drainage systems and storage facilities, capable of organizing agricultural surplus on a regional scale. Here are traders, carrying Crete and pottery and stone vessels to Egypt and the Levant, and bringing back copper and ivory, and ideas. Here are frescoes, showing young athletes leaping over the backs of charging bulls, showing women in elaborate flounced skirts and gold jewelry that wouldn't look out of place in a museum of contemporary design. And here, underneath all of that, is the sea. Always the sea. The element that made it possible. The war highway, and the ladder, and the borderless frontier that the Minoans seemed to have understood, more deeply than almost anyone else in the ancient world. And then it ended. Not slowly, not through gradual decline, the way civilizations often go, not through the quiet erosion of a society that simply ran out of ideas. Something happened, something specific and catastrophic, and what was left afterward was so different from what had been before, that the gap feels less like change and more like severance. That question of how a civilization that had mastered the iron for centuries could come apart so completely is the thread running through everything we're going to look at tonight. It's worth sitting with for a moment, because it can look, and it's the kind of question that says something not just about the past, but about how fragile the things we build always are. If you're listening to this right now, and you're already starting to drift a little, that's exactly what this is for. I make these for the moment when you want something to follow into sleep, something that takes you somewhere real, without demanding too much. So, if you're finding your way to this for the first time, maybe think about hitting subscribe, and if you're listening on Spotify, you can follow the show there for ad-free music, free listening, which a lot of people find easier when they're actually trying to sleep. The link is in the description, and it really does support the work in a meaningful way. Before we go any further, I want to know where you are right now and what time it is, 'cause these episodes go out and come back to me from all over the world. Someone in Melbourne with the ceiling fan going and the sun already up. Someone in Edinburgh with rain on the window and the city gone quiet. Someone in Vancouver or Nairobi or Seoul lying in the dark. Following these words somewhere further and further back in time, I checked the comments. I read them. It genuinely matters. So, we're going to move through the Minoan world carefully and in order, starting with the geography that made everything else possible, then the archaeology of the early settlements, then the palaces themselves, then the trade, networks, and the art, and the writing, and the political world of the Bronze Age Aegean, and then eventually the volcano. There is a volcano. There is always a volcano when the story is this old. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're at the beginning, looking at a sea, scattered with islands, and somewhere in the middle of it all on a long island in the southern Aegean, a civilization is just starting to figure out what it might become. Picture the Aegean from above, not from a satellite, not with the clean geometric certainty of a modern map, but from something lower, something more human, the way a sailor in a small wooden boat might have understood it after years of crossing it. What you see is not empty water. It's a puzzle of land and sea, so finely interlocked that in some places the boundary between island and mainland barely seems to matter. The cycle alone, that scattered arc of islands in the central Aegean, number more than 200 if you count the small ones. Paros, Knossos, Delos, Syros, Thera. They sit in the water like stepping stones, close enough that ancient navigators could move between them without ever losing sight of land for very long. This is the first thing to understand about why a maritime civilization was possible here, and why it happened here rather than somewhere else. The geography practically demanded it because the alternative to sailing in the ancient Aegean was walking, and walking meant mountains. The Greek peninsula is deeply corrugated, all ridges and ravines, the kind of terrain that turns a 20-meter journey into an ordeal. Moving goods over land, moving armies over land, maintaining any kind of regular connection between communities, separated by those ridges, was slow and expensive and dangerous in ways that sea travel counterintuitively often was not. The sea had predictability that the mountains didn't. The Aegean runs on seasonal wind patterns that ancient sailors learned to read the way we might read a clock. The meltome blows from the north in summer with reliable consistency. Sailors who understood it could use it, lean into it, plan their routes around it the way you might plan a road trip around highway speeds. The currents, too, follow patterns. There's a broad circulation that moves counterclockwise through the Aegean, and a sailor who understood that circulation wasn't fighting the sea. They were using it, being carried by it, arriving where they intended to arrive. Bronze Age maritime travel wasn't reckless. It was skilled, and the people who had been doing it longest were the most skilled of all. So when we talk about the connected world of the Bronze Age, Aegean, we're really talking about several overlapping regions that the sea linked rather than separated. Sit in the south, large and fertile and positioned almost exactly at the crossroads between the Aegean proper and the wider eastern Mediterranean. The Cyclades in the center, smaller and more numerous, valuable not just as waypoints, but as sources of specific materials. Knossos had the finest emery in the ancient world, a stone so hard it could grind and polish other stones. The obsidian of Melos, a volcanic glass that was being traded across the Aegean as far back as the Mesolithic tens of thousands of years before the Minoans. To the east, Anatolia, the western edge of what is now Turkey, where cultures like the one at Troy were developing their own complex societies with access to both Aegean and Black Sea routes. To the west and north mainland Greece, not yet what it would become, but already occupied, already trading, already part of the network. And then beyond the Aegean entirely, Egypt to the south, the Levantine coast to the east. These were not distant abstractions. They were trading partners, sources of raw materials, destinations for iron goods. How do we actually know this? Because the objects don't lie, even when the written records are absent or unreadable. Pottery is the workhorse of Bronze Age archaeology, not because it's glamorous, but because it survives, because it was made in recognizable regional styles, and because it turns up everywhere. It has no business being if trade wasn't happening. Minoan-style pottery found in Egypt, Egyptian fanspeeds found in iron contexts, Crete copper ingots shaped in the distinctive oxhide form that made them stackable in a ship's hold, turning up across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The copper itself can be chemically fingerprinted back to specific ore sources, which means when archaeologists find a Bronze Age axe in Crete, they can sometimes tell you that the copper in it came from Cyprus or Sardinia or somewhere else entirely. Stone vessels made from Crete and limestone have been found in Egypt. Mino and fresco appear on the walls of a palace at Avaris in the Nile Delta. This is not coincidence. This is a world in conversation, which brings us to a word that gets applied to the Minoans and then immediately argued, over allocracy, from the Greek words for sea and power. A sea empire, essentially. The 5th century historian Thucydides uses the term when he writes about a Cretan king named Minos, who supposedly controlled the Aegean and suppressed piracy. And there's been scholarly argument ever since about whether that tradition reflects a real, political reality or a much later myth dressed up as history. The honest answer is probably somewhere between the two. The Minoans almost certainly didn't control the Aegean in the way an empire controls territory, with garrisons and governors and explicit tribute, but they appear to have shaped it, economically and culturally, in ways that amount to something like dominance, even if it wasn't called that. The Bronze Age Aegean was a connected world long before anyone thought to call it Greek. It had its own logic, its own networks, its own centers of gravity, and near the center of that gravity, something was growing on Crete. By the time that something began to matter, Crete had already been inhabited for thousands of years, not by kings in labyrinthine palaces or fleets of painted ships, but by people whose names we will never know, whose existence we infer from broken pots, stone tools, and discolorations in the soil. The first settlers seem to arrive in the Neolithic, somewhere around 7000 B.C., perhaps a little earlier. How they got there is already a clue to what comes later. Sit is not the kind of island you accidentally wash up on while chasing goats along a sandbar. It sits far enough from the mainland that even in the Stone Age, reaching it required boats capable of crossing open water and people confident enough to try. So from the very beginning, the Cretan story is a maritime story. The island is settled by people who already know how to move across the sea. At first, their lives would have looked familiar to anyone living in early farming villages anywhere in the eastern Mediterranean. Small communities hugging the coasts and low-inland valleys. Fields scratched into the soil with simple tools. Domesticated sheep and goats and pigs, grazing whatever rough pasture the island could offer. The wild landscape of Crete, its steep interior mountains and narrow plains, meant that there were natural limits on where you could live and how much you could grow. Archaeologists talk about carrying capacity, the maximum population an environment can support without degrading it. And on an island like Crete, that concept isn't theoretical. There are only so many well-watered valleys, only so much arable land before you hit rock and slope. That constraint did something important. It encouraged people to cluster where water and good soil were available, and it forced them to become very good at getting the most out of limited space. Over time, fields were terraced to hold thin soils in place. Flocks were managed carefully to keep from stripping the hills bare. Agriculture and herring weren't just economic activities. They were long, slow negotiations with the land itself. We can see hints of this negotiation in the pollen record. In the gradual shift from wild vegetation to plant communities dominated by species associated with grazing and cultivation. We see it in the bones recovered from early sites, the changing proportions of wild to domesticated animals, the gradual increase in sheep and goat, the island-adapted cattle. And we see it in the layout of those early settlements. They start small, just a handful of houses, then grow denser with more structures, more storage, more signs that people are staying put for generations rather than drifting in and out. Some of the earliest known sites like Knossos begin as just this kind of village, a cluster on a gentle hill above a fertile plain, close to water, close to the sea. In the beginning, there's nothing to tell you. This place will someday become a sprawling palace complex, influencing an entire sea. It's just one more community of farmers and herders, people who know the seasonal rhythms of planting and harvest, lambing and shearing. But even in these seemingly modest beginnings, something else is happening. Alongside agriculture and herring craft, traditions begin to deepen. Neolithic pottery on Crete starts out much like pottery everywhere else in the region. Hand-shaped, functional, sometimes burnished, occasionally decorated with simple patterns. By the early Bronze Age, though, those pots are changing. They become thinner, lighter, more standardized. Shape and surface treatment vary by region and by period in ways that archaeologists can now recognize almost at a glance. That is not the work of part-time potters. That is the work of specialists. The same pattern appears with other crafts. Weaving, which leaves only indirect traces in the archaeological record. Loom weights, impressions of textiles in clay, seems to become more elaborate. Spindle wools of different weights suggest fine yarns as well as coarse, and the distribution of these tools hints that some households or some neighborhoods were more deeply involved in textile production than others. Stone vessels carved from local limestone and harder imported stones appear in increasing numbers. Some are simple bowls and jars. Others are so finely worked, so thin-walled, that they must have taken many hours of skilled labor to produce. Early metallurgy joins this growing toolkit. Copper begins to be worked on in the 3rd millennium B.C.E., and while at first it's mostly small tools and ornaments, the knowledge itself is transformative. Copper doesn't occur everywhere. Ore must be found, extracted, traded. To work it, you need not just the metal, but charcoal, crucibles, molds, and above all, expertise. Metal workers understand temperatures and timing, when to quench and when to hammer. In many early societies, that kind of technical knowledge carries status all by itself. All of this specialized pottery, weaving, stone carving, metallurgy points to a quiet but profound shift. When some people are able to spend most of their time making things instead of growing food, it means someone else is producing enough food to support them. Surplus is beginning to appear, not as vast state granaries yet, not as the monumental storage magazines you might picture inside later palaces, but as extra grain sealed in jars, flocks that are slightly larger than one family strictly needs, olive oil and wool, and wine that can be set aside rather than immediately consumed. Surplus, in turn, opens a door to inequality. We don't have written records from this early period on Crete, so we don't know what anyone called themselves or how they justified their authority. What we have are patterns in the material remains. Some houses are larger than others, Some burials contain more and better grave goods. Certain sites begin to show concentrations of storage facilities, workshops, and imported materials. Obsidian from the Cyclades, exotic stones, perhaps metal from Cyprus. This suggests something more than simple village equality. It suggests households or lineages that were able to control the flow of goods. One plausible scenario, and it's only that, is that early elites on Crete began as managers of risk. On an island with finite arable land, harvests will vary. Some years are generous, some are lean. Families that can accumulate surplus in good years can then loan seed or food in bad ones. They might organize communal labor to build terraces, dig systems, or maintain paths between scattered communities. In return, they receive goods, loyalty, prestige, control over stored grain, over herds, over access to imported items like obsidian or metal becomes the foundation for power. Exchange amplifies this. Boats that once carried families and livestock now also carry goods. Pottery, made in one valley, appears in another. Stone vessels, made near good quarries, travel down to the coast, and from there, cross the sea. People who can broker these exchanges, who know the right people in the right coves, who can promise to deliver wool in the autumn in exchange for copper in the spring, gain influence that extends beyond their home village. But we have to be careful not to let later stories color this picture too strongly. The Greeks of the classical period told tales about Minos, king of Crete, ruler of the sea, judge of the dead. They imagined labyrinths and man-eating monsters, human tributes and heroic slayers. Those myths are part of why the Bronze Age Cretans ended up being called Minoans in modern scholarship. But they were written down more than 1,000 years after the palaces fell. They're not eyewitness accounts. They're reflections, distortions, distant memories at best. Archaeology gives us a different kind of story. It's quieter, full of gaps, more comfortable with uncertainty. We can trace changes in house plans, see when walls get thicker, or rooms become more numerous. We can measure the increase in craft production, the first signs that certain settlements are pulling ahead in size and complexity. We can map how imported objects cluster at specific sites. From this researchers infer the rise of local elites who leveraged both surplus and exchange to build their position. What we don't see yet in this pre-palatial phase is the kind of centralized, planned, monumental architecture that screams palace. The centers that will later dominate eastern and central Crete, Phaistos, Malia, Zakros, are all occupied, all growing, all plugged into wider networks. But they are still villages and towns, rather than royal capitals. The stage is set. Though you have an island, close to its carrying capacity, in the best lands, with people who have been managing agriculture and herring for millennia, you have specialized crafts, surplus production, and emergent elites who understand the value of controlling storage and exchange. You have communities already accustomed to looking outward across the water for materials and opportunities. Under those conditions, it doesn't take much. A few generations of consolidation, a few ambitious families, a shift in how power is displayed for something new to appear in the landscape. Not just big houses, but something bigger than any house has the right to be. The first palaces rising over the fields, turning the quiet calculations of surplus and trade into a new, visible, enduring kind of power. When those something bigger than any house has the right to be buildings finally arrive, they don't tiptoe onto the landscape. They appear within a few centuries of each other, at places that had already mattered for a long time. Knossos in the north, looking toward the Cyclades and the Greek mainland. Phaistos on the south-central plain, facing the Aegean Sea and the routes toward Africa. Malia on the north coast further east. And a bit later and smaller, Zakros, tucked into a protected bay on the island's eastern edge. Archaeologists call them palaces, and that word carries all kinds of baggage, thrones and crowns, and royal bedchambers. But what rises in the Middle Bronze Age on Crete is at least as much a machine as it is a residence. These complexes are sprawling multi-story constructions with hundreds of rooms, wrapped around broad central courts. They're built and rebuilt over generations. Floors resurfaced, wings added, stairways shifted. The effect, if you could walk into one at its peak, would not just be size, it would be density. Corridors turning at odd angles, rooms giving onto other rooms, stairs leading to terraces and upper stories. A place where space itself has been folded and refolded to serve a new kind of social logic. At the heart of that logic is storage. Running along the sides of these palaces, especially at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia, are long, narrow rooms archaeologists call magazines. Their floors are scored with shallow pits, and those pits once held pithoi, massive storage jars as tall as a person, sunk partway into the ground for stability. Some magazines line up in parallel, like aisles in a warehouse. Others snake around corners, forming mazes of clay and stone and sealed mouths. When you see one or two pithoi in a village house, you can imagine a family's harvest. When you see dozens upon dozens arranged in ordered rows, you are looking at something else. This is surplus on a scale no single household can plausibly claim. Grain, olive oil, wine, pulses, maybe even dried figs and other staples, all brought together under one roof, measured, recorded, guarded. This is one of the reasons many scholars see the Cretan palaces as administrative hubs. They don't just accumulate goods, they organize them. Nearby you find weighing stones, ceilings impressed with tiny carved designs, early tablets. You find evidence that these stores were not static hoards, but part of a system. Goods coming in from the countryside, being held, and then going out again in some managed, predictable way. It's often called a redistributive economy. The idea is simple enough. Farmers and herders in the surrounding territory send a portion of their production to the palace. In return, the palace supplies what those producers need, but cannot easily provide for themselves: bronze tools, luxury textiles, perhaps imported pottery, maybe even seed grain and livestock during bad years. Laborers who work on palace projects, building, maintaining roads, crafting specialized goods, may also receive rations from these central stores. If that picture is even roughly right, then the palace is more than a big house. It is a node where the flow of food, raw materials, and finished goods is gathered, reallocated, and symbolically framed. Control over that flow becomes one of the main levers of power. But the economic machine is only one layer. Over and around it, the palaces knit people together through something more ancient than bureaucracy: ritual. Those broad central courts, open to the sky and carefully paved, are not good places for storage. They are good places for gathering. The surrounding architecture is built to look inward at them. Doorways opening out, balconies and upper rooms with views down into the open space. It is easy to imagine people assembled there for events that mattered: seasonal festivals, processions, performances that combine dance, music, and offerings. We find evidence of large-scale feasting in association with palace centers: heaps of animal bones, concentrations of drinking cups and serving vessels, installations that seem designed for cooking and distributing food on a big scale. Feasts do practical work. They help consume surplus before it spoils. They reward participants in communal labor, but they also do political work. Sharing food and drink under the gaze of the palace, perhaps in front of shrines embedded into its walls, turns ordinary calories into signs of belonging and hierarchy. Those who control when the feasts happen, who stands where, who receives the best cuts of meat and the most elaborately decorated cups, are not just hosts. They are specialists in social chemistry, managing the mix of generosity and dependence that keeps people invested in the palace order. Ritual and redistribution blur. Receiving grain from the magazines and wine at a festival may feel to those who live under this system less like a tax refund and more like a blessing. To keep all of this running, shipments in, rations out, flocks moved, feasts planned, word of mouth is not enough on the time these first palaces arise. We see a quiet but profound technological shift: the appearance of writing. The earliest Cretan scripts, often called Cretan hieroglyphic and Linear A, are not the kind of writing you use to compose epics. Most of the texts we have are short, formulaic, and attached to objects. They show up on clay tablets, on nodules and tags, on stone and clay ceilings that once sealed jars, doors, or baskets. They are administrative notes more than literature, little anchors of information in a sea of movement. Alongside the scripts, there is a flourishing of seal use. Tiny carved stones, signet rings, lentoid seals, scarabs carry unique designs, spirals, animals, myths, abstract patterns. Pressed into wet clay, they leave impressions that function like signatures or brands. A sealed jar in a palace storeroom does not just contain oil, it carries the mark of whoever sent it, or whoever has authority over it. A string-bound bundle of goods closed with a lump of clay and a seal impression tells you if it has imprecking and by whom. This combination of early writing and seal imagery does something very new. It links identity, goods, and authority in a way that is portable and verifiable. You don't have to know the person who sent the shipment. You only have to recognize the seal. The palace becomes a place where trust is mediated by marks in clay and signs on tablets, not just by personal acquaintance. All of this is fed by, and in turn feeds the island's geography. Each palace center is embedded in a local landscape of farms and smaller settlements, and also oriented out toward the sea. Knossos sits above the richest plain on Crete, but it is also pulled toward the north coast by a corridor of low land that makes moving goods relatively easy. Phaistos commands the wide, fertile Messara plain and looks toward the harbors of the south coast. Myia lies right on the shore, with direct access to anchorages, while its hinterland climbs gently inland. Zakros nestles in a pocket of arable land, but opens directly onto a deep bay at the island's eastern edge. In practice, this means the palaces act as bridges. Inland, they collect produce from villages, terraces, and upland pastures. Outward, they dispatch finished goods, surplus, and perhaps prestige items across the Aegean and beyond. Boats pull up to Cretan coves, laden with metal ingots, exotic stones, fine pottery from other lands. They leave carrying Cretan oil, wine, textiles, and crafted objects. The same architecture that gathers grain also gathers information about distant places, distant partners, distant storms. Were these palace centers all part of a single island-wide state? Or were they independent, sometimes allied, sometimes competing powers, each with its own sphere of influence? Here the evidence thins, and interpretation takes over. Some researchers point to similarities in architecture, art styles, and administrative practices across the palaces and see coordination. They imagine a Cretan-wide system, perhaps even something like a unified kingdom with Knossos as a primus inter pares, first among equals. The myth of Minos, with its picture of a ruler whose authority reached across the sea, has encouraged that reading. Others look at the differences, the distinct local pottery traditions, the way each palace seems to focus on its own hinterland, the lack of clear physical evidence for a single bureaucratic center, and favor a more fragmented picture, a patchwork of regional polities connected by trade and shared ritual forms, but not subordinated to a single throne. In this view, power on Crete is negotiated and competitive. Palaces mirror and rival each other, rather than taking orders from a central authority. Both models have to reckon with the same basic facts. The rise of large, complex centers that gather and redistribute resources, the embedding of ritual and feasting into that economic framework, the use of writing and seals to extend control and identity, and the integration of inland production with maritime exchange. Whether under one crown or several, the palaces represent a new experiment in how humans can organize themselves around the sea. For the farmers sowing fields in the shadow of these buildings, for the shepherds bringing flocks to lowland pastures, for the potters and weavers working in palace-adjacent workshops, daily life may not have felt like living inside a grand historical shift. It may simply have felt like sending a portion of the harvest up the hill and in return receiving tools, protection, participation in festivals that lit up the year. But seen from a longer distance, what is happening on Crete is extraordinary. A landscape once dotted with villages is now anchored by a handful of towering complexes that bind together production, belief, and exchange. A new kind of power has taken shape, less about personal strength or charisma, more about control over systems. And those systems increasingly run along the same paths that brought the first settlers to the first island's shores, the winding tracks inland, and the blue open routes across the sea. If the palaces are machines, the sea is their conveyor belt. Crete and power in this period is often called thalassocracy, a rule of the sea. But we have to be honest about what we can and can't see. Wood rots, rope decays, sails vanish. No Minoan ship has come down to us intact. What we do have are images and echoes. Fleets painted in tiny detail on wall fresco, ships scratched into seal stones, little gold signet rings where boats skim above waves, and later Greek descriptions of Crete and seamanship that probably preserve some distant memory of what once was. Put those fragments together, and a picture starts to form. The typical Minoan seagoing vessel, as far as we can reconstruct it, was long and relatively narrow, with a high prow that curved forward like an animal's beak, and a stern that rose, and prays, sometimes hooked inwards, line the sides in neat ranks. On the fresco, 20, maybe 30 rowers, to a side. For longer ships, seated low, their strokes coordinated. Amidships, some depictions show a mast, with a single square sail furled or billowing. This combination of oars and sail is practical. Oars give control in tight harbors and in calms. Sails take over when the wind cooperates. These are not giant war gargs of the later classical world. They look more like versatile workhorses, capable of carrying cargo, people, and if needed, armed men. Some are small enough to be beached or pulled onto shore. Others are big enough that they probably needed simple harbor works, or at least sheltered coves, to load and unload. How did they navigate here, too? Direct evidence is thin, but the constraints of the Bronze Age Mediterranean give us some clues. Without magnetic compasses, without accurate long-distance maps, sailors lean on three things: coasts, winds, and stars. Most Minoan voyages were almost certainly seasonal. The calmest, safest period for travel in the Aegean runs from late spring through early autumn. When storms are less frequent, and the prevailing northerly winds, the Aegeans blow more steadily. These winds can be both friend and obstacle. Sailing north into them is a slow, beating affair. Sailing south or southeast is much easier if you plan your routes with that in mind. The network of islands between sighted and the Greek mainland suddenly becomes a chain of stepping stones rather than a wide, risky gap. Coastal navigation would have done most of the work. Crews hug shorelines when they can, keeping land in sight, using headlands, distinctive peaks and bays, as waypoints stored in communal memory. Oral sailing directions. Leave this island on your left. Steer toward that mountain until you see the next cape are enough to guide you through the Aegean, if repeated often. Passed down from older sailors to apprentices for open stretches, or night sailing when necessary. The sky takes over. We know from later Greek tradition that constellations like the Bear and stars like Arcturus and Sirius became reference points for navigation. There is no reason to think Bronze Age sailors lacked that observational skill. People who spend their lives on coasts notice which stars rise and set over particular landmarks, which patterns rotate around the northern sky. They don't need a written astronomy to use the heavens as a slow-moving compass. All of this only matters if you have places to go and places to come back to. Sit coastline is folded and intricate. Headlands, coves, small plains that open suddenly onto the sea. Very few of these have left clear-cut remains of quays or piers from the Middle Bronze Age. Erosion and later building projects have eaten away at whatever was there. Even so, a number of spots look very likely to have been main harbors or anchorages. On the north coast below Knossos, the land opens toward the sea around modern Heraklion and Amnos. Finds of Minoan warehouses and harbor structures in that area suggest it functioned as the outward-facing mouth of the Knossian machine. Further east, Malia sits almost on the shoreline. Just beyond it, Gentle bays would have offered shelter to ships coming in from the Cyclades. On the south, the Messara plain is tied to a handful of good anchorages, like Komos, where archaeology has turned up large buildings, sometimes interpreted as harbor facilities, long rooms, ramps, storage areas that make sense in a context where goods arrive by boat and need to be moved inland. Establishing a harbor in this world doesn't require massive stone piers. A naturally protected bay, a gently sloping beach where you can drag up smaller hulls, a rocky point that breaks incoming waves. These are enough. Add a few built features, ramps, simple jetties of timber and stone, sheds for gear, shrines to whatever powers sailors think guard their crossing, and you have a place that ties sea routes to the inland road system and ultimately to the palaces. Living in such places shapes culture quietly but profoundly. Children in coastal villages grow up with tides and swells as part of their sensory world. They learn the smell of a storm before the clouds arrive. They hear long before they can row the stories of rocks just under the surface, of a cove you only enter from one direction, of the time someone's relative didn't make it back. Fishing isn't just an occupation. It's a daily calibration of risk and reward. How far out to go, which sculls might bring a good catch, when to turn back. Minoan iconography hints that fish and sea creatures were not just food, but also imaginative presence. Marine motifs ripple through their art. Octopuses curling over jars, dolphins arching between borders, shell and wave patterns curling around cups. You don't get that density of imagery without a community for whom the sea is constant background. Seafaring skill in this context is not limited to fishing. It feeds directly into trade, diplomacy, and communication. A coastal captain who knows the quickest route to Thera or to Mitos is also the person a palace official needs when sending a shipment of oil or a delegation with gifts. Information rides on the same hulls as a textiles. A storm witnessed off the coast of one island is within days a topic of conversation in a Cretan harbor tavern. News of political trouble, of a failed harvest, of a new source of copper can move around the islands surprisingly fast. When every sailing season sees dozens, maybe hundreds of short and medium-range hops linking communities. This speed matters. A palace that can learn quickly that a partner on the mainland is in difficulty can adjust its shipments, shift alliances, seize opportunities. A harbor town that hears early that pirates have been active along a particular stretch of coast can warn its fishermen to stick closer to home for a while, because the sea is generous, but it is never safe. Bronze Age ships are at the mercy of sudden squalls, shifting winds, submerged rocks. A sudden change in weather can turn a routine crossing into a disaster. The line between safe and sunk is often invisible. A slightly overloaded cargo, a misjudged entry into a harbor with a following sea, a rope that snaps under strain. And then there are other humans. Piracy in the Aegean is older than writing. Any world where goods move by water and where enforcement is patchy and local generates opportunities for taking by force what others have gathered. Later sources describe bands of sea raiders operating from marginal coasts and islands. It's reasonable to think something similar existed in the Minoan period, even if the scale and organization remain debated. A well-loaded merchant vessel is a tempting target, especially if you know its route and schedule. Yet, despite storms and the risk of attack, the maritime networks tied to Crete not only functioned, they flourished for centuries. Palatial economies seem to count on seaborne exchange. Cretan pottery turns up in distant ports. Foreign materials appear in contexts. People kept building ships, kept launching them, kept trusting that most of the time the voyage would end with a safe landfall. Part of the explanation is simple. The rewards outweighed the risks. Access to metals, to fine stones, to prestige goods, the ability to sell surplus oil and wine, the soft power of arriving with gifts and exotic objects, the sheer formational advantage of being plugged into a wide network. For coastal communities, the sea offered a path to prosperity that the inland hills could not match. Part of it may also have been cultural. If your stories, your rituals, your seasonal rhythms All assume that the sea is the way things move, then to abstain from voyaging is almost unthinkable. You adapt instead. You watch the sky more closely. You build slightly better hulls. You offer slightly more lavish sacrifices at the shoreside shrine before a departure. Still, as alluring as this picture is, it rests on partial evidence. We infer hull shapes from paintings that may exaggerate for aesthetic reasons. We guess at harbor layouts from fragmentary walls and floor levels now half drowned, buried. We project patterns of navigation from later Greek practice, and from what works in similar conditions. Reconstructions of Minoan shipping, how many vessels, how big, how far they regularly went, are models, not certainties. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that by the height of the palace period, Crete was deeply entrenched in a seaborne world. Its people had learned to read winds and stars, to turn rocky coves into gateways, to weave fishing, trade, and diplomacy into one fluid practice of moving across water. The sea was not a boundary. It was the everyday medium through which their power, their goods, and their stories flowed. And on those same routes that carried jars of oil and packets of wool, something else was traveling as well. Ideas, images, religious symbols. To see how far those traveled and how they changed along the way, we have to look beyond the Trend, nearest headland, out toward horizons where Cretan ships met strangers and new worlds of exchange opened. Follow those ships beyond the nearest islands, and the cargo they carry starts to tell a much larger story. In the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, copper is the quiet heartbeat of power. No copper, no bronze, no tools and weapons worthy of the name. Crete has a few small copper sources, but nothing on the scale required to feed a flourishing palatial system. The bulk of the metal has to come from elsewhere. To the east, Cyprus sits in the sea like a great lump of ore. Its very name in later languages will be tangled up with the word for copper. To the north and northwest, Anatolia offers rich deposits. Somewhere in those directions, Cretan ships are sailing, loading raw copper in ingots, maybe shaped like oxides or flat cakes, stacking them low in their hulls, then turning back toward home. Copper alone isn't enough to make true bronze. You need tin, and tin is elusive. It does not lie ready at hand in the eastern Mediterranean in any great quantity. The most likely sources lie far away in central Anatolia, perhaps even further east into Iran, or Central Asia, or westward in the Balkans. We don't have a Minoan map with neat arrows drawn to each origin, but we do have traces, the chemical fingerprints of metal. Modern Akrotiri works a kind of quiet magic. By analyzing trace elements and isotopes in copper and bronze artifacts, researchers can sometimes link them back to specific mining regions. When a blade from Crete matches the geochemical profile of ore from Cyprus or the Taurus Mountains, it implies that someone somewhere moved that metal across the sea or along the overland routes that feed into it. Multiply that by dozens, hundreds of objects and patterns emerge. Not just isolated journeys, but established chains of exchange, and copper and tin are only the beginning. Gold gleams in Minoan graves and shrines, small ornaments, rings, thin sheets applied to wood that's long since decayed. Crete has almost no native gold to speak of. That sheen points outward to Egypt and Nubia, to Anatolian rivers, washing nuggets down from mountain veins. Ivory shows up too, carved inlays, small statuettes, delicate boxes. There are no elephants on Crete. The tusks have to come from Africa or Syria, traveling by ship in bundles, traded and retraded, until they reach an iron workshop where a craftsman coaxes dolphins or goddesses out of their dense, creamy curves. Then there are the less glamorous but more voluminous goods, textiles, oil, wine. The palaces seem to specialize in oil, not the crude, cloudy stuff you might squeeze in a village courtyard, but carefully processed olive oil stored in large, standardized jars. Some of it is for local use, lighting, cooking ritual. Some of it almost certainly is for export. Cretan pithoi and transport amphi turn up on other islands and on distant coasts. Their forms are distinctive enough that archaeologists can recognize them even when the contents have long since vanished into the soil. Textiles leave fewer direct traces. Cloth rots. Dyes fade. What we see are loom weights, spindle walls, impressions of woven fabrics on lumps of dried clay that once wrapped bundles or sealed containers. Still, the sheer number of these tools in palace contexts suggests large-scale production. Fine wool, linen blends, patterned and dyed fabrics. These are light, high-value goods that travel well by ship, perfect for gift-giving and trade. When foreign art begins to show figures dressed in garments that look a lot like Cretan styles, flounced skirts, tightly cinched waists, it hints that these textiles or their designs are moving along with the jars of oil. Wine is more ambiguous. Grape cultivation is ancient in this region. Multiple cultures produce wine. But again, specific Cretan vessel types spread. Some carry Rhenus or spiced wines. Others may hold must ready for further processing. A ship leaving a Crete and harbor laden with jars is probably carrying a mix. Oil, wine, maybe dried figs or pulses together, forming the economic backbone of the palace outward flow. How do we know where all these things go? Partly from distribution. When you map where Cretan pottery turns up from the Cyclades to the Greek mainland, from the Levantine coast to the Nile delta, you start to see the outline of a trading web, partly from chemical sourcing, not just for metals, but for clays, and even for residues inside containers. When the clay of a jug found in an Egyptian town matches the geology of central Crete and the faint, chemical ghosts inside suggest olive oil, you're looking at a 3,500-year-old export statement. Beyond the raw materials and containers, their style. Around the 2nd millennium BCE, a certain international style blossoms along the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. Elite objects from very different cultures start to share motifs and ways of depicting the world. In Egypt, frescoes appear that show foreigners in clothing and with hairstyles that look strikingly iron. In Canaanite palaces, you find inlaid furniture with curving plant forms and rosettes that would not be out of place in a hall at Knossos. Onet. Meanwhile, artists experiment with lotus flowers, papyrus, and sphinx-like creatures that have clear Egyptian or Near Eastern cousins. This is not crude copying. It feels more like a shared visual vocabulary that develops as artisans, patrons, and objects move around. When you see a box from Syria using a combination of Egyptian lotus, Cretan spirals, and local deities, it suggests more than a simple commodity chain. Ideas are flowing with the goods. Craftsmen may be traveling. Princesses may be arriving with dowries. Diplomats carry gifts that set fashions in far-off courts. The Cyclodes sit in the middle of all this, stepping stones between Sit and the mainland. And they are not just passive relay points. Long before Cretan palaces reach their peak, Cycladic islands carve abstract marble figurines and make distinctive painted pottery. Later we find Cretan-style pottery on Cycladic islands and Cycladic obsidian and marble in Cretan contexts. Designs mingle spiral patterns, bird and boat motifs, ways of laying out space on a vase. The movement of obsidian, metals, and finares suggests regular contact. The blending of styles hints at something richer, a dialogue in form and meaning. But what kind of exchange is this really? Were Minoan harbors bustling commercial markets in the modern sense? Or are we looking at a world where most long-distance movement of goods happens as gifts, tributes, and ceremonial exchanges between elites? Here scholars disagree, and the evidence can be read more than one way. On one hand, the regularity and volume implied by the archaeological record, the widespread of standardized containers, the consistency of palace storage facilities, seem to point towards something like organized trade. Palaces might supervise production, arrange shipments, keep accounts in their still undeciphered linear script. A steady trickle of surplus oil and textiles flows out. Metals and prestige goods flow in. Prices in some amorphous form must exist, even if they're not written down as such. On the other hand, texts from neighboring cultures like Egypt and the Levant emphasize gift, exchange between great kings. They talk of sending gold, oil, fine garments, and exotic animals as gifts of friendship, not as sales. The language is ceremonial, the relationships framed as reciprocal bonds rather than purely economic transactions. It's possible that what we would call trade is in their conceptual world mostly dressed as diplomacy. Crete leaves us no deciphered letters to clarify its side of that relationship, so we balance possibilities. Maybe both systems coexist. At the top, rulers exchange lavish gifts that cement alliances and display power. Below that glittering surface, more ordinary traders, sailors, and local officials arrange ongoing flows of grain, oil, tools, and pottery, using habits and expectations rather than formal contracts. A ship may carry both, a chest of gold or a carved ivory piece for a foreign palace, and deck after deck of jars representing slower, steadier economic ties. Whatever the exact mechanics, the consequences for Sith's palaces are enormous. Wealth coming in from abroad, metals, foreign luxuries, exotic animals, colored stones, feeds the prestige of the palace elites. They can commission more art, sponsor more elaborate rituals, reward followers with imported finery. The sight of a ruler wearing gold that clearly came from far away, drinking from a cup in a style known from Egypt, surrounded by ivory-inlaid furniture, reinforces the idea that the palace is plugged into a wider, potent world that ordinary villagers can barely imagine. But dependence cuts both ways. If your weapon tips, your tools, your showy ornaments, and the oil and textiles that pay for them all rely on long-distance seawares, then your power sits on something fragile. A disruption in those routes, wars in the Levant, political collapse in a key metal source, a run of bad seasons that reduces surplus for export, or simply a shift in who controls critical harbors, can ripple back into your storerooms and your throne room. Palatial centralization amplifies this vulnerability. When so much wealth is funneled through a few nodes, Knossos, Malia, Phaistos, any shock to the flow of copper, tin, or prestige goods doesn't just inconvenience a few traders. It threatens the very system that holds the society's elite structure together. Officials who can no longer distribute imported luxuries may find loyalty harder to buy. Artisans dependent on foreign materials lose work. The ideological claim that the palace mediates between Crete and the wider world starts to ring hollow. For a long time, the gamble pays off. The ships keep moving. The metals keep coming. The jars of Cretan oil and wine keep finding foreign. Crete rides the swell of an interconnected Bronze Age world. And just as goods and wealth move along those sea lanes, so do less tangible things, patterns of ritual, styles of art, ways of writing. To understand how deeply this web of exchange seeped into the Cretan imagination, we have to step inside their frescoed rooms and sacred spaces, and watch how they turned trade, nature, and power into symbols. Walk into a Minoan palace in your mind, and the first thing that hits you isn't the architecture, it's the color. Walls that in their time blazed with reds, blues, and golds. Floors patterned with spirals and rosettes. Columns painted so vividly they almost seemed to breathe. Almost every surface that could take paint or carving seems to have been used as if bare plaster, and undecorated stone were mildly offensive. Those frescoes are some of our best windows into what mattered to these people. They don't show endless lines of soldiers like later Greek or Near Eastern art. Instead, you see landscapes wildly stylized but still full of life. Lilies bending in an invisible breeze, rocks painted in almost psychedelic colors, little birds perched on cliffs. Then there are the sea scenes, dolphins arcing through water, schools of fish, octopuses with curling tentacles wrapping themselves around entire pots. Nature isn't just a backdrop, it feels like a companion. On ceramics, the same motifs spill and multiply. Early on, geometric bands and simple plant patterns dominate. Later, in the so-called marine style, whole vases become swirling underwater worlds. The potter shapes the vessel. The painter covers it in life. You get the sense that someone who spent a great deal of time on the sea and in the fields is now reimagining those experiences in clay and pigment, turning everyday surroundings into patterns that repeat, echo, and comfort. Then there are the seal stones. Tiny, often no larger than a fingernail, but cut with astonishing care. Spirals, animals, hybrid creatures, human figures in dancing or ritual poses. These seals are practical tools. You press them into wet clay to mark ownership, to close a container, to say this passed through my hands. But they're also little tokens of identity and belief. A merchant, an official, a priestess perhaps chooses a particular image to stand for them. A bull, a goddess, a double axe, a ship taken together, frescoes on the walls, motifs on ceramics, symbols on seals. These images form a kind of visual language, a set of signs that repeat across objects and centuries. We can't read it the way we read writing, but we can see patterns in what appears where and how. Certain themes cluster around spaces we think of as religious or political. And everywhere, sooner or later, the bulls appear. Sometimes realistically, great powerful animals charging across a painted field. Sometimes stylized, reduced to a massive head and horns, the rest of the body implied. Occasionally, they're paired with human figures in scenes that might show bull leaping, athletes vaulting over the backs of charging animals, twisting in mid-air, in poses that seem almost weightless. It's not hard to see why later Greeks spun tales about Minos and his bull, about a monstrous minotaur locked in a labyrinth, about young men and women from other cities being sent to Crete as tribute to face it. Do Minoan palaces literally contain labyrinths? The word itself, in later Greek, may connect to labis, the double axe symbol that shows up in Minoan art and ritual spaces. Knossos, in particular, is sprawling and complex. Corridors turning on themselves, staircases, side rooms, storage magazines like rows of small caves. To someone from a simpler settlement, it might well feel like a maze. Myths have long memories, but they don't preserve events in straight lines. They compress, distort, and dramatize. It's possible that behind the story of a king, a monster, and a labyrinth, there's a blurred recollection of bull-centered rituals performed in vast, confusing palatial spaces. Perhaps of foreign youths brought to Crete for service, fosterage, or as hostages folded into rituals they half understood. The details are gone. The echo remains. If palaces were stages for power and spectacle, the island's high places and hollows were something else again. Across Crete, archaeologists have found what they call peak sanctuaries, shrines perched on mountain ridges, rocky knolls, steep hills with wide views. They're not grand temples of marble. They're more like open-air altars. On some of these sites, you find small clay figurines, humans with arms raised, animals, miniature offerings broken deliberately, scattered across the summit, as if used and used again over long spans of time. Down below, in caves, you find a different sort of sacred space. Deep chambers with stalactites and stalagmites shaped by water and time. In a few of these caves, later Greek myth will place the birth or hiding of Zeus. In the Bronze Age layers, we find votive figurines, bronze objects, sometimes traces of feasting, peak sanctuaries, caves, small rural shrines, palatial courtyards. Taken together, they suggest a religious life that was not confined to a priestly elite behind closed doors. People from surrounding settlements may have climbed up to high places at certain times of year, bringing offerings. Families may have traveled to special caves for rites of passage, healing, or ancestral remembrance. The exact rituals are lost to us, but the distribution of offerings hints at shared practices that were communal, recurring, and anchored to the land itself. In the images that cluster around these sacred spaces, one question keeps surfacing. Who holds power here? Minoan art gives a prominent place to elaborately dressed female figures, women in flounced skirts, tight bodices, bare breasts, often standing or seated in commanding poses. They hold snakes, or lilies, or staffs. They appear on signate rings, in what look like ritual scenes, at top shrines, under sacred trees, flanked by attendants. Scholars have long debated whether these are priestesses, goddesses, or some fusion of the two. Male figures certainly appear, especially in athletic or processional contexts, bearing offerings, handling animals, leaping bulls. But in strictly hierarchical or numinous positions, the balance of representations often seems to tip toward women. Does this mean Minoan society was matriarchal, or that women dominated political life? Not necessarily. Iconography can exaggerate, simplify, or idealize. A culture might worship goddesses without granting everyday women unusual authority, or certain public roles, ritual leadership, festival performance may have been strongly feminized, while land ownership, warfare, and diplomacy remained male-dominated. Without readable texts, we're left with silhouettes and possibilities. The art itself points us towards cycles. On seal stones and fresco, you sometimes see processions, lines of figures bearing vessels, animals, sheave. They move toward a central figure, or shrine, towards a raised platform, towards a tree that seems more than just a tree. These scenes feel like snapshots of recurring events, festivals, time to the turning of the year. Sit's economy, like all agrarian economies, depends on cycles: sowing and harvesting grain, the fruiting of olives and vines, the breeding and shearing of sheep. Add maritime trade to that, and you get sea cycles too. Sailing seasons when winds and currents are favorable, stormy months when ships stay in harbor. It's not difficult to imagine a ritual calendar woven through these rhythms. Spring festivals to mark planting and the return of calm seas. Late summer or autumn rites to celebrate harvest and the pressing of oil and wine. Perhaps, combined with meetings where rulers redistribute surplus and reaffirm their place as mediators between land, sea, and people. Winter observances, linked to the turning of the year, to darkness and renewal, to the dangerous months when food stores and political alliances are both tested. Every time a community gathers for such an event, the palace has an opportunity to host, to display stored wealth, to perform rituals in which rulers stand closest to the divine symbols: bulls, double axes, sacred trees, powerful goddesses, and thus appear necessary to the continuing balance of things. Religion, agriculture, and authority braid together. Through all of this, it's important to remember that art doesn't just show how life is. It shows how a society wants life to be remembered. The bull leapers in the frescoes may be idealized athletes, not daily reality. The peaceful landscapes might smooth over harder truths of toil, storm, and scarcity. The abundance of fish and flowers on pottery could be a wishful doubling of nature's generosity. Powerful women and serene goddesses might be aspirational images of order and fertility, even when the world outside the palace walls is messy and uncertain. Yet exactly because it is aspirational, this art tells us what Minoans thought worth aspiring to: grace in movement, intimacy with the natural world, ritual gatherings in carefully framed spaces, a social order in which the palace anchors the island's relationship to land, sea, and the unseen. To see how the aspirational world was organized, and how power and memory were fixed to clay and tablet, we have to turn from images to incised lines, from frescoed walls to small impressed marks that still refuse to speak in words we can understand. On the day someone first pressed a reed or stylus into soft clay on Crete, the island changed in a way no fresco can quite show. Instead of flowing lines of dolphins and lilies, the marks are compact, repeated, almost severe, tiny wedges, strokes, and angles arranged in tidy rows. We call this script Linear A. It appears first on small clay tablets, on ceilings that once closed jars or boxes, on little three-sided nodules that hung from strings. Someone has counted something, recorded something, labeled something. Sheep, grain, oil, cloth, names of people, names of places, or perhaps of gods. We don't know. Linear A looks a bit like its mainland cousin, Linear B, and some signs are clearly related. But when scholars try to read it using Greek, it refuses to resolve into meaning. We can hear the scratch of the stylus, but not the voice behind it. The problem is partly mathematical. We don't have enough text, and what we have is mostly short, repetitive, and very specialized. Accounting notes are wonderful for reconstructing economies, but terrible for cracking a language from scratch. Imagine trying to learn English from nothing but grocery lists. Milk, eggs, flour, the same words over and over, rarely a sentence, never a story. We can guess some things by comparing Linear A with Linear B, which was used a little later on the Greek mainland, and at Knossos under Macedonian rule. Linear B was deciphered in the 1950s and turned out to write an early form of Greek. Its tablets are full of recognizable words once you know the code. Names of gods that appear in later Greek myth lists of chariot parts, wine rations, slaves, herds. Linear A uses many of the same signs, but when we read them with the sound values they have in Linear B, the resulting words don't match anything known. That suggests that before the Minoans, Crete was writing a different language altogether, a local tongue indigenous to the island, or perhaps a family of related dialects, none of which survived into the age of alphabetic Greek. So we stand in front of these tablets and see structure without translation. Columns, headings, totals, numbers we can read, signs we can categorize. But the spoken words beneath the signs are gone. Even so, the physical remains of writing tell us a surprising amount about the system that produced them. Clay tablets en Crete were never meant to last. They were temporary documents, air-dried, and then in normal times probably recycled, soaked, kneaded, used again. The only reason we still have them is because palaces burned. The fires that destroyed storerooms and halls also fired the clay hard enough to survive for 3,000 years. When archaeologists sift through these charred archives, patterns appear. Tablets are grouped by rooms, by subjects. One area of a palace holds records about sheep and wool, another about oil, another about offerings. Ceilings show the impressions of dozens, even hundreds of different sealstones. A shipment of oil from a rural villa might be sealed by the overseer in the countryside, then by an official at the palace magazine, then perhaps by a scribe noting its entry into storage. This is bureaucracy. Not in the modern sense of printed forms and stamps, but in the older, more elemental sense, a system of people and procedures that counts, records, and reallocates resources at scale. Someone is responsible for knowing how many jars of grain were collected from a district this year, how many sheep belonged to which estate, how much cloth was assigned to outfitting temple personnel or palace workers. The smallness of the clay tablets and ceilings is misleading. Out of such small marks, large systems are held together. Here the comparison to Linear B matters on the mainland. In the later Macedonian palaces, the writing system is broadly similar, but the language is Greek, and we can follow it. We see clear evidence of a highly centralized redistributive economy. The palace collects wool, then assigns it to named women workers. It keeps track of bronze, chariots, rowers, horses, and religious offerings in meticulous lists. Officials have sharply defined titles. Territories are segmented into name districts. On Crete before the Macedonian takeover, the pattern of documents looks broadly familiar. Lots of inventory lists, many of them tied to palatial storage. But without the words, we can't be sure the underlying logic was the same. Were Minoan palaces already managing everything from sheep to sailors in a tight top-down system as Macedonian palaces would later do, or did their records lean more toward ritual obligations, offerings, and seasonal dues, with more economic autonomy left to villages and estates? The tablets themselves sit between those possibilities, suggestive but not decisive. This is what undeciphered writing does to the past. It opens doors just enough to prove there is a room behind them, then leaves us outside. We can say that Minoan society was literate in a restricted administrative way. Not everyone could write, but some trained specialists could. We can say that the existence of so many ceilings and tablets points to a level of administrative complexity beyond face-to-face memory. You don't invent and maintain a writing system like Linear A unless you have recurring needs it uniquely solves. Tracking large volumes of goods, coordinating multiple sites, tying local production into central storage. We cannot yet say what Minoans called themselves, what names they used for their gods, how they justified palatial authority in words, what legal concepts they recognized, how they narrated their own history. Those questions live precisely in the domain of language, and for now, the language is opaque. Still, even without sound or meaning, the script and its uses reveal something about power and fragility. A good bureaucracy smooths out shocks. If one harvest fails, stored surplus can be redirected. If a ship sinks, recorded obligations can be adjusted. One estate owes less this year, another more. The palace with its scribes and storerooms becomes both the memory and the balancing mechanism of the wider society. That kind of system can make an island chain-wide network more resilient to ordinary ups and downs. But it also creates dependence. If your access to grain, to oil, to work, to sacred offerings all runs through a palace archive, then your community's security is tied to that center functioning. Fire in a storeroom is no longer just fire. It's a blow to the record of who owns what. The loss of scribes is not just a human tragedy, but an amnesia for an entire region. If the palace falls, the system that translated local labor into island-wide stability can unravel very quickly. In that sense, the quiet tablets from Crete are both reassuring and a little haunting. They show us that long before Greece, as we know it, people on these islands had learned to organize complexity with marks on clay. They also hint that when the centers they served went dark, much more vanished than painted walls and stone columns. Some of what was lost is purely practical. The exact ratios of wool to cloth, the tax on olive groves, the schedule of shipments, but some of it is likely deeper. Myths written down, if they were ever written, hymns and prayers, if they were ever committed to clay, local histories, if they ever existed outside of spoken memory. We don't know how much of that was actually written, and how much remained oral. What we do know is that an entire written language, once everyday and unremarkable to its users, became unreadable in the space of a few interrupted generations. That ongoing silence runs like a faint undertone through every storeroom and archive with degracing dues. As we move forward in the story into ages of rivalry, eruption, and takeover, Linear A sits in the background like a closed book on a burned shelf, proof that a complex world was there even when we can no longer hear its words. While scribes on Crete were pressing their reeds into clay, something a little different was taking shape across the water on the rocky mainland. Here the land is harsher, fewer broad plains, more broken-up lands. Instead of one big island with a dense ring of coasts, there are valleys cut off from each other by ridges, each with its own fields, its own hilltop, its own ambitions. Out of these landscapes, a new kind of palace culture coalesced, the Mycenaean world. We don't know what the people of Mycenae, Pios, Terrans, or Thieves actually called themselves. Later Greeks looked back and saw Ans, Argons, epic names attached to heroes and sieges. But in the late Bronze Age, before any Homeric poet began to sing, the reality was more practical and in some ways more familiar. Stone citadels rise on defensible heights. The walls at Myene and Tiryns, when they finally appear, are massive enough that later generations called them Cyclopean, as if only giants could have lifted those blocks. Inside, there are palaces with central hearths and frescoed walls, storerooms, workshops, and small archives written in Linear B. The script looks like a cousin of the Cretan Linear A, but the language beneath it is Greek. The tablets from these mainland centers read like a sharpened version of what we glimpsed on Crete. They list flocks, fields, rations, workers, temples, offerings. But they also dwell on things that feel distinctly martial: chariot wheels, cuirasses, helmets of boars, tusk, lists of rowers, allocations of bronze for swords and spearheads. If Cretan palaces look sideways towards sanctuaries and storerooms, Mycenaean palaces look outward toward walls and war gear. This doesn't mean the mainlanders were simply more warlike in some timeless essential way. It means that in the complex web of the Iron, power was increasingly defined, not only by who could, but can host the grandest festival, or sponsor the most elaborate ritual, but by who could put ships in the water, men on those ships, and weapons in their hands. Crete did not ignore these realities. Its own iconography, usually so graceful, sometimes shows swords, shields, and armored figures. Weapons and fortifications appear on the island, especially in the later phases. But from quite early on, the archaeology suggests a two-way relationship between Crete and the mainland, full of borrowing, copying, and perhaps quiet rivalry. Pottery styles that originate on Crete are imitated and adapted in mainland workshops. Elite graves in Mycenaean centers contain Cretan-style goods, fine decorated jars, carved stone vessels, delicate goldwork that speak of either direct imports or craftsmen who had learned techniques. Seal stones in Mycenaean tombs carry motifs that would not be out of place in a Cretan shrine. Spirals, griffins, marine creatures, goddesses with outstretched arms. At first glance, this could look like cultural conquest from the sea. The older theory of thalassocracy, that Minoan Crete ruled the waves, enforcing a sort of maritime empire over the Aegean, grew out of these observations. Cretan style shows up in so many places that it is tempting to picture Cretan fleets, patrolling the islands, extracting tribute, installing friendly elites. There may be a grain of truth in this, but the details are fuzzy. We don't have Cretan victory inscriptions boasting of conquered cities. We don't have clear chains of Cretan garrisons or administrative outposts stamped in linear A. What we have is influence, and influence can travel in more than one direction. A mainland chief who wants to impress his rivals may not need to be conquered by Crete to adopt things. He just needs to decide that Cretan goods confer prestige because they are rare, beautiful, or associated with powerful partners overseas. He might send a relative as a guest or hostage to a Cretan court, marry a woman from an island lineage, invite Cretan artisans to work in his service, or simply buy what he can from traders who move between harbors. Intermarriage is elusive in the archaeological record, but it is a reasonable bridge between what we see and what we don't. Marriage has always been a quiet tool of diplomacy. A daughter sent to a distant palace is also a living treaty, a line of communication, a way of sharing styles, rituals, and technologies across otherwise separate networks. In that light, a Cretan-style ring in a grave in the Argalide might be less a badge of subjugation than a sign of connection, a reminder that beyond the fortress walls, there is a world of partners, rivals, and kin across the sea. At the same time, the Mycenaean palaces were not passive recipients. They developed their own aesthetic, their own religious emphasis, their own take on power. Their architecture centers on the Megaron, the rectangular hall with a central hearth and throne, which becomes a hallmark of mainland palatial design. Their tablets, read line by line, show a strong concern with mustering and provisioning fighting forces. If prestige goods define who sits at the top of the regional hierarchy, military capacity defines how secure that position is. Prestige is a delicate thing. A Cretan-crafted cup in a Mycenaean ruler's hand might say, "I am wealthy, connected, and sophisticated." But the same ruler's ability to summon hundreds of rowers, equip them with oars and spears, and send them to escort merchants, or to intercept someone else's cargo, speaks a more coercive language. The balance between these two forms of power, soft and hard, is part of what shaped the late Bronze Age Aegean. When we look for clear lines, Crete dominant first, then the mainland, it is easy to oversimplify. The actual pattern is more like overlapping circles, zones where Cretan influence is stronger, zones where Mycenaean influence grows, and in between islands and coastal cities that navigate between them, choosing alliances, trading with both, watching which way the wind of power seems to be blowing in. This in-between space, imitation and rivalry, are two sides of the same coin. A Myngian artisan who copies a Cretan motif on a sword hilt might be honoring Cretan status, while also declaring, "We can do what they do." A Cretan workshop that adopts mainland weapon forms might be acknowledging that prestige now flows not just from peaceful abundance, but from the symbols of war. As the 15th and 14th centuries BCE approach, the archaeological record begins to tilt. Mycenaean goods appear in greater numbers on Crete, Linear B. The mainland script starts to show up at Knossos. Mainland weapons, armor, and burial forms become harder to distinguish from those of Cretan elites. Scholars debate whether this marks a sudden conquest, a gradual infiltration, or a negotiated transfer of power. But the direction is clear. The mainland is no longer just a pupil. It is becoming a rival, and then in some sense a successor. All of this unfolds against a background of fragility. We have already seen palaces on Crete and on the mainland both depend on complex systems stored, surpluses, wide trade networks, tightly managed labor. They smooth out local failures, but make the whole more sensitive to big shocks. A bad harvest in one valley can be absorbed. A series of bad years across multiple regions is harder. A lost ship here or there is a setback. A sustained disruption to sea routes could be lethal when two or more palace systems sit within sailing distance of each other, sharing styles, but also competing for the same metals, the same timber, the same prestige partners in Egypt and the Levant. The stakes rise. Diplomatic marriages and shared iconography can soften conflicts, but they also knit the systems together. A crisis in one can ripple quickly into the others. Later stories about kings, sieges, and heroic duels remember these centuries in the language of personal glory and wrath. The evidence we actually have is quieter and more fragmented. Shifts in pottery, layers of ash, abandoned workshops, changes in writing systems. Behind them, we can sense a landscape where prestige and power were always being renegotiated, where and Mycenaean elites watched each other closely, borrowing, competing, and preparing. In such a tightly coupled world, any major environmental or political shock, a failed run of harvests, a disease in herds, an earthquake, or something larger, would not land on a blank slate. It would hit a system already stretched between cooperation and rivalry, already balanced on the ability of palaces to keep promises, feed dependence, and project strength across the sea. One of those shocks was already brewing quietly in the rock of a nearby island on Thera. An ancient volcano was waking up. Thera is not a big place. If you sail north from Crete into the middle of the Aegean, the island doesn't rise out of the water like a single mountain. It curves. Even today, the inhabited rim of Santorini is just the surviving edge of an older volcano, a broken circle of land around a flooded caldera. In the Bronze Age, before the Great Eruption, that circle was more complete. The interior less drowned, the shape a little different, but the basic reality was the same. This was a volcano sitting right inside the Minoan world. We don't know what its inhabitants called it. Later Greeks knew the island as Thera. Modern tourists know it as Santorini. In the 17th century B.C.E., it was one more stop in a dense web of sea routes linked to Crete, the Cyclades, and beyond. The people who lived there shared in the same broad culture we've been tracing. Similar pottery styles, similar wall paintings, similar ways of organizing streets and houses. To a sailor from Knossos or Phaistos, Thera would have felt both familiar and just different enough to be interesting. On the southern edge of the island, perched above the sea, there was a town we now call Akrotiri. Akrotiri is the closest thing we have to a time capsule of the Aegean before the blast. Because when the volcano finally erupted, ash fell over the town, filling rooms, strengthening walls, sealing everything in place. Centuries later at Pompeii, the same process would preserve Roman streets. On the it froze a Minoan-style community at a particular moment in the late Bronze Age. When archaeologists began to uncover Eri, what emerged was not a primitive fishing village. It was an urban settlement with paved streets, drainage systems, multi-story houses. Some buildings had internal staircases, upper floors, light wells to bring sun into interior rooms. Walls were plastered and painted in color. Storage jars stood along walls and in corners, some still holding traces of what they once contained. The frescoes are especially revealing. They do not obsess over war or rulers. Instead, we see flotillas of ships moving between harbors, rocky islands crowned by buildings, people carrying offerings, youths leaping over bulls, landscapes with lilies and swallows. One famous room shows a miniature panorama, ships leaving one shore, arriving at another, towns watching from their terraces. To lie down and let your mind drift across those painted waters is to glimpse how Akrotiri's people saw themselves embedded in a seascape of constant movement. There are no bodies preserved in the ash, no chaotic heaps of valuables abandoned mid-flight. Instead, many heavy storage jars seem to have been emptied. Some rooms show signs of deliberate clearing. Staircases remain intact, indicating time passed between destructive earthquakes and final burial. It looks less like a panic-stricken surprise, and more like an orderly departure from a dangerous place that points us toward another side of the slow awakening of the volcano. Volcanoes seldom explode without warning. Magma rises, gases build, the shape of the ground changes. On the probably meant episodes of earthquakes, some minor, some major, cracks in walls, collapsed buildings, springs shifting or drying, perhaps small ash falls, a dusting on fields, the smell of sulfur on the wind. For a population used to living with tremors, Crete and the Aegean are seismically active. Even now, earthquakes would have been frightening, but not incomprehensible. Houses could be repaired, shrines rebuilt, offerings made. But if the shaking became more frequent, if ash began to fall more often, if the sea behaved strangely, people would have noticed patterns. A shrinking harbor, a shoreline that no longer looked the same, booming noises from within the earth. At some point staying would have felt more dangerous than leaving. The archaeological layers at Akrotiri suggest this shift. Beneath the ash, we find a town that had been damaged, repaired, damaged again. In some buildings, lower floors show earthquake cracks that were stabilized. In others, objects are stacked as if being sorted. Large storage jars missing their contents imply that food, oil, or other staples had already been removed. People had time, not years perhaps, but time enough to take what they could carry and board ships. This is how a sudden disaster stretches out into a long, uneasy prelude. From the perspective of volcanic geology, the eruption is an instant. From the perspective of human lives, it may have been the culmination of a generation's worth of rumbling omens, with each new tremor prompting another round of repairs, another quiet discussion about whether to stay. When exactly this all happened is still debated. For much of the 20th century, scholars synchronized the eruption with Egyptian historical chronology, using imported artifacts as anchors. On that basis, many placed the blast around the mid-500s B.C.E. Then scientific dating methods complicated the picture. Radioarbon tests on organic material, buried in Theronin ash, olive branches, seeds, bits of wood, pushed the likely date earlier, perhaps into the 1600s B.C.E. Ice cores from Greenland, tree rings from Europe and North America. Some of these too seem to carry traces of a major volcanic event slightly earlier than the traditional archaeological date. The result is not a neat single number, but a range and a set of competing models. Some researchers argue for a high chronology in the late 1600s BCE, others for a lower one, closer to the older Egyptian-based date. New samples, improved calibration curves, fresh excavations, each can nudge the debate, tightening or shifting the window. For a sleep-drifting mind, this might sound like detail fit only for footnotes. But it matters because moving the eruption, even a few decades forward or back, changes which palaces were standing, which trade routes were mature, which generations on Crete and the mainland would have watched the sky darken. What we can say cautiously is that by the time Thera finally blew, the island was thoroughly integrated into the Minoan sphere. A series fresco shows the same general type we see in Crete and art. Pottery links the town into wider exchange networks. Objects from Crete and other islands end up in its houses. Whatever language was spoken in those streets, it shared a visual and material vocabulary with Knossos, and with ports scattered all across the Aegean. So when we picture the lead-up to the eruption, we are not imagining an isolated community cut off from the world. We are picturing a nodal point in a much larger system. Ships would have carried news as well as goods. A captain harboring at Akrotiri might hear that somewhere else along the arc of islands, the sea had receded strangely, or ash had fallen, or flocks had sickened. Priests and divers would have tried to read meaning in the earth's unrest. Some might have argued that the gods were angry but could be appeased. Others might have counseled withdrawal, at least for a time, until the signs improved. This is the paradox of large disasters in complex worlds. To later storytellers, they can look instantaneous. One moment there is a flourishing town, the next there is ruin. In lived experience, they are often protracted. A series of warnings, half measures and provisional returns to normal right up until the day, when there is no more normal left to return to. On the day came when the volcano finally broke its long preparation and vented its stored energy into the sky and the sea. But before we turn to the blast itself, the ash clouds, the tsunamis, the shock waves spreading outward, it is worth lingering one last moment in that quiet interval just before. The streets of Akrotiri are swept. Many rooms are bare, as if waiting. The town is not a scene of panic, but of absence. Somewhere over the horizon, ships are already carrying its people away. They do not yet know that when they look back, the island they left will no longer be the island that remains. When the volcano finally went, it did not begin with the tidy cone-shaped blast that appears in school book illustrations. It began as a column. Imagine a pillar of ash and gas punching into the sky, driven by magma turning to steam in an instant. As molten rock rose and met seawater and groundwater, it fragmented violently into dust and pumice. That mixture, hotter than any forge, shot upward in a roaring plume that may have climbed tens of kilometers high. Within minutes, perhaps day over that became something else. Not night exactly, but a dim, shifting half-light under a boiling ceiling of ash. Pumice and ash began to fall back onto the island and into the sea around it. Pumice is so full of bubbles that it floats. Bronze Age sailors in other parts of the Aegean might have seen patches of the water turn pale and strangely solid, thick with drifting stones. Closer in, on the decks of any ships still near Thera, the air would have filled with choking dust, flakes of hot rock raining onto timbers, masts, and rigging. As the eruption intensified, the column may have become unstable, collapsing under its own weight. When that happens, the ash and gas no longer rise. They surge outward, hugging the ground in fast-moving pyrolastic flows. Those flows roared down slopes and across low ground, obliterating whatever structures still stood, then poured into the sea, displacing enormous volumes of water in an instant. This is one way to make waves. The idea that the Theron eruption generated tsunamis is widely accepted. Undersea deposits of disturbed sediment and layers of tsunami, washed material on islands, closer to Crete, fit the pattern of great waves sweeping in from the direction of the models. Suggest that as pyrolastic flows entered the surrounding water, they pushed walls of sea outward that could have raced across the iron, refracting around headlands funneled into bays. What those waves looked like when they reached Minoan harbors is harder to say, and here the debate begins. Some reconstructions imagine towering breakers many meters high, smashing into the north coast of Crete, surging up beaches, toppling harbor installations, tossing ships far inland. In this view, fleets morrowed along the Cretan shore would have been ripped from their anchors, thrown against one another, or hurled ashore, hulls shattered like toys. Quay and breakwaters carefully built over generations could have been undermined or swept away in an afternoon. Other researchers argue for more moderate scenarios. They point out that distance underwater topography and island chains between the and would have absorbed some of the energy. In these models, waves still arrive, still dangerous, still capable of flooding low-lying coastal settlements and battering ships, but not necessarily rewriting every shoreline. A patchwork of impact, some harbors devastated, others merely shaken, still others spared by the shape of the seabed and the turn of the coast. What everyone agrees on is that for people who lived by the water, the sea they trusted suddenly betrayed them. To a sailor or dock worker in a Minoan port, a tsunami might not look like a single apocalyptic wall of water. It could begin with oddities, the tide running too fast, water dragging itself away from the shore, leaving fish flapping on suddenly bare sand. Then a distant roar, then the return, A surge, or a series of surges, climbing higher than any remembered storm, carrying timbers, cargo, and fragments of houses back out as the water withdrew. You can imagine the confusion. Boats hauled up onto beaches for safety might be lifted and carried inland instead. Warehouses near the waterfront, soaked with cedar and silt. People running, shouting, then stumbling through swirling debris. And while the waves did their work at sea level, ash went on falling from the sky over the nearby islands. That ash settled in extraordinary depth, meters upon meters in some places, explaining the preservation of Akrotiri. Farther away, it would have arrived as a fine dusting, then a thicker veil coating slopes and fields. Volcanic ash is not like fireplace soot. It is tiny fragments of glass and mineral, abrasive, weighty when wet. On roofs, it accumulates. On leaves, it clogs pores, dulls green to grey. Short-term, this would have been ruinous for crops unlucky enough to be in their growing season. Vines, olives, grains, and vegetables breathe through their surfaces. A heavy ashfall can suffocate plants, strip branches, and lay down a crust that seeds cannot easily penetrate. Pastures meant for grazing might be blanketed. Livestock forced to nose through unfamiliar grit to reach anything edible. Systems for drinking water could be contaminated. Eyes and lungs would burn on larger scales. Volcanic eruptions of this kind can nudge the climate. High in the stratosphere, tiny particles and sulfur compounds reflect some sunlight back into space, cooling the surface slightly. Ice cores from Greenland and tree rings from temperate regions show hints of a climatic hiccup, around the time some scientists place the eruption. A year or a few years of reduced growth in trees patterns, consistent with a short-lived, volcanic winter. But tying those signals to this specific volcano remains contentious. Other eruptions can leave similar marks, so here too we tread carefully. It is possible that in the years after Thera, weather across parts of the eastern Mediterranean and beyond was somewhat cooler, harvests somewhat less reliable. It is also possible that any broader climatic effects were small enough to blur into the usual variability of Bronze Age seasons. The evidence is suggestive, not definitive. What is clearer is that even without a long global chill, the Iron World experienced a sharp, localized crisis. Imagine what happens to a sea-based trading system when ports are flooded or damaged, when ships are lost, when navigation near a volatile island suddenly feels dangerous. Routes that once seemed routine, Citra, the sick ladies, up toward mainland Greece, or east toward Anatolia, would now be shadowed by stories of vanished capes, floating pumice, treacherous currents. Captains might delay departures, choose more roundabout routes, or avoid certain waters altogether. Insurance in a world without insurance becomes hesitation and rumor. Goods that normally flowed steadily, tin, copper, fine textiles, oil, wine, crafted pottery, might pile up in some places and fail to appear in others. A palace expecting regular deliveries to feed its workers and specialists could find rooms uncomfortably bare. Officials responsible for redistributing grain and oil would be forced into triage, choosing which dependent to supply, which building projects to slow, which feasts to postpone. In clay tablet archives from slightly later periods, we see how finely balanced these systems could be. Rations carefully counted, shipments noted, lists of personnel who depended on the central storehouses. Even if our surviving records from the exact moment of the Theron eruption are fragmentary or absent, it is reasonable to imagine similar paperwork suddenly straining under unexpected shortages. Here the scholars divide again. Some argue that the eruption and its immediate aftermath dealt a crippling blow to Minoan power. Fleets shattered by tsunamis, coastal centers wrecked. A central authority on Crete struggling to cope with lost ships, damaged ports, and failing harvests, opening the door for rivals on the Greek mainland to step in. In this view, the blast is the turning point, the moment when an entire sea-oriented civilization begins to unravel. Others see a more nuanced picture. They point out that many Cretan sites continue to show activity after the likely date of the eruption. Palaces are repaired or rebuilt. Art and luxury goods still circulate. From this angle, Thera is a heavy blow, but not a knockout. One disaster among several, in a long, complex sequence of stresses, earthquakes, political shifts, changing trade patterns, and later, the ambitions of Macedonian elites. Between these interpretations lies a shared recognition. The eruption did not happen in a vacuum. It struck a network, not just an island. For people trying to sleep in palatial apartments on Crete or in modest houses on smaller islands, in the months and years afterward, the consequences would have been felt not as grand historical arcs, but as inconveniences that hardened into anxieties, a missing shipment, a leaner ration, a relative who failed to return from a voyage north. Priests might have added new rituals to plate the sea. Administrators might have redrawn schedules and accounts. Farmers might have scraped ash from their fields and hoped that next year would be kinder. The sea, once a dependable highway and provider, had shown that it could also be a pathway for ruin. And while the waves eventually stilled and the ash settled, something in the relationship between islanders and their watery world had shifted. In the next phase of the story, we watch how that shift played out over decades, in rebuilding and adaptation, in subtle changes to trade, and in the slow emergence of new powers who would learn from Minoan strengths, while quietly exploiting Minoan weaknesses on and itself. The story did not end with flooded harbors and grey fields. It bent. Archaeology shows rebuilding in several palatial centers, walls shattered by some earlier shock. Earthquake, tsunami, or both, are patched and strengthened. Fallen stones are gathered, reset, new floors laid over toppled ones. At Knossos, at Phaistos, at other sites, there are phases of renovation after the period many scholars associate with the Thera eruption. From the ground up, resilience might have looked practical rather than heroic. People shoveling ash off roofs and out of systems, carpenters replacing warped timbers, potters firing new storage jars to replace those broken and collapsed storerooms, scribes, or the people who oversaw them, recalculating rations in light of the grain that's actually arrived. Even the palaces themselves, those great nodal points of Minoan power, carry marks of adaptation. Some storerooms are reorganized, drainage channels are altered. In certain places, architectural features thought to be purely ceremonial are modified in ways that suggest more concern for stability and function. A civilization used to living alongside earthquakes and the whims of the sea was once again adjusting. But resilience does not mean everything goes back to the way it was. The Aegean is a region where the ground likes to move. The same tectonic forces that built volcanic islands and deep basins also drive repeated earthquakes. The Thera eruption was likely not an isolated event in an otherwise peaceful geological age. It may have been one dramatic episode in a longer period of heightened seismic activity. Imagine trying to rebuild a harbor town when the earth under your feet keeps giving small reminders. A tremor that rattles jars on their shelves. A crack that slowly widens in a palace wall you just repaired. Each quake might not be catastrophic, but together over years, they erode certainty. In some Cretan sites, layers of destruction and rebuilding follow one another in relatively quick succession. Mud brick walls sagging on damaged stone foundations, then patched. Floors cracked and overlaid with new plaster. To archaeologists, this reads as a sequence: shock, repair, shock, repair. To the people living through it, it might have felt like the gods or the earth had become unpredictable. Unstable ground has consequences that ripple beyond architecture. If you are a farmer whose terraces keep slumping, you harvest less. If you've a merchant whose preferred port now silts up differently after a quake-disturbed landslide, your travel plans change. If you are a ruler whose storerooms are twice in need of rebuilding within a generation, your prestige does not shine quite as brightly. Add to this the more subtle after-effects of an eruption. Even a modest downturn in harvests, whether from ashfall, short-term climate quirks, or just disrupted agricultural cycles, can tighten the margin between sufficiency and anxiety. A year of thin grain is survivable if the palace can open its reserves. 2 or 3 in a short period, especially when trade routes are still unsettled and construction demands resources for rebuilding, begin to sting. Famine is a strong word, and the evidence for full-scale famine across city after Thera is not severe, conclusive, but localized shortages, uneven harvests and periodic hunger are easier to imagine. In such conditions, disease often finds more room to work. Malnutrition lowers resistance. Crowded quarters in and around palatial centers, especially if people have moved in from damaged coastal villages, increase contagion. We do not have a list of illnesses that walked through late Bronze Age Crete. What we have are patterns that recur in many societies under stress, hints of demographic fluctuation in burials, signs of abrupt abandonment in some hamlets, and the logic that where food supply is fragile and people are displaced, microbes usually travel well. Migration is another quiet consequence. When certain fields yield poorly or particular harbors no longer feel safe or profitable, some families look elsewhere. They might shift from one side of the island to another, drifting toward regions where palace officials are still building, still offering work and rations. Others might look north to the mainland or to other islands that seem for the moment more stable. Archaeologists notice changes in which sites grow and which shrink, in where imported pottery appears, in how far Cretan styles travel, and how strongly foreign styles penetrate Cretan assemblages. These are the fingerprints of people moving, craftsmen, traders, perhaps even small groups of refugees, carrying their skills and their anxieties with them. All of this begins to press on something more abstract, but just as real political legitimacy. Minoan palaces were not simply big houses. They were centers that claimed implicitly or explicitly to manage the relationship between people, land, and the divine. They stored the harvest, organized the labor, sponsored the rituals. In return, they expected loyalty, service, and perhaps most importantly, belief that their way of ordering the world was the right one. As long as the storerooms were full, the festivals impressive, and the ships returning with exotic goods, that belief was easy to maintain. But what happens when ships fail to return on schedule? When rebuilt port facilities crumble again in an aftershock, when the rains do not come as expected, or come all at once and wash away the soil loosened by earlier quakes? For ordinary farmers and townspeople, palace power might begin to feel less like a guarantee and more like a gamble. If the central court cannot prevent disaster, can it at least respond well to it? Does it distribute scarce grain fairly, or are certain lineages favored? Do repairs focus on religious monuments and elite quarters, while humble neighborhoods fend for themselves? We do not hear the complaints of a disgruntled Bronze Age dock worker, but we can read one indirect sign: shifts in the built environment. Fortifications, for instance, are surprisingly rare around early Minoan palaces. Later in the Bronze Age, in some places, defensive works and more controlled access routes become more visible. It may be that in a world of repeated shocks, rulers began to feel not just the earth, but their own status shaking. The weakening of one center often looks like opportunity from another. Across the water on the Greek mainland, elite groups in places like Mycenae, Tyrans, and Thebes were already watching the seas. They had their own palaces, their own warrior aristocracies, their own ambitions. For generations, they had been on the receiving end of Crete and goods and perhaps Cretan influence. Frescoes, pottery styles, and certain religious symbols suggest a long history of contact and imitation. If word filtered across that some Crete and harbors were damaged, that certain routes had become unreliable, that particular palaces were slower to send or receive goods, mainland leaders might have sensed a gap opening in the network. Maybe at first they stepped in simply as alternative partners, offering their own harbors as transshipment points, their own merchants as intermediaries. Over time, economic footholds can become political ones. We should be cautious here. There is no single clay tablet that reads in effect, "Thera exploded, and we took advantage." Instead, there are overlapping lines of evidence. Mason pottery becoming more common in Cretan contexts after certain destruction layers. architectural and administrative features on Crete that look increasingly mainland in style. Later traditions that remember powerful kings on the Greek mainland reaching across the sea. Rather than a sudden invasion triggered by one bad day in the Aegean, many historians imagine a drawn-out process. Rebuilding on Crete proceeds, but under growing strain, economic, social, and perhaps spiritual. Earthquakes keep coming. Trade slowly reorients. Some local elites seek allies or patrons beyond the island. Mainland powers watching carefully extend their influence step by step. The Thera eruption in this view is not the lone cause of Minoan decline, but a heavy weight added to a scale already loaded with other pressures. Seismic unrest, unstable harvests, disease, population shifts, and external opportunism all press upon a system that had worked beautifully under calmer conditions. From a distance of 3,500 years, it is tempting to look for one neat explanation, one turning point when a flourishing sea civilization simply broke. The evidence resists that simplicity. What we see instead are cracks appearing in different places at different times, some patched, some widening, while people kept planting, sailing, washing, and repairing as best they could. In the next stage of the story, those widening cracks would meet new hands. Mainland rulers and warriors who would walk the corridors of palaces, adopt much of what they found there, and in doing so, help close one chapter of Aegean history while opening another. When we talk about Mycenaeans on Crete, we are really talking about a shift that leaves more traces on clay and in storage rooms than on battlefields. At Knossos, the great palace on the north coast, later levels begin to look different. One of the most telling changes is almost painfully mundane: the writing system. For centuries, Minoan administrators used a script we call Linear A. We can recognize its signs, we can copy them, but we still cannot read it with confidence. Then, after a certain point in the archaeological layers, another script appears on the tablets: Linear B. Linear B is closely related in form to Linear A, but it encodes a very different language. When it was finally deciphered in the 20th century, it turned out not to be some unknown tongue of the islands, but an early form of Greek, not the Greek of Plato or Homer, but distant kin. These later Knossos tablets record rations, lists of workers, allocations of wool, bronze, and perfumed oil in an unmistakably Greek language running through a Cretan script tradition. This is our clearest sign that something in the palace hierarchy had changed. The scribes themselves might have been locals retrained to write a new language. The physical technique of incising wet clay, the habit of stacking tablets in particular rooms, the use of sealings and labels continues. But the words they are capturing, the names of officials, the titles, the formulas of administration, now point toward a mainland-type palatial system, the kind we see at Mycenaeans and Thebes. From those parallels, archaeologists infer that the Knossos of this period was probably being run, at least at the top, by elites who thought and organized in a Mycenaean way. They used Greek as their administrative language. They slot their officials into roles: collectors, supervisors of flocks and fields that match the bureaucratic machinery visible in other Mycenaean centers. How that situation came to be is less clear, and this is where models multiply. One picture imagines a straightforward conquest: warriors from the mainland crossing the sea, taking advantage of weakened Cretan centers and seizing Knossos by force. In this scenario, a Mycenaean dynasty installs itself in the palace, bringing its own court language and administrative habits. Some scholars point to traces of weapons, to mainland-style grave goods, and to the appearance of more militarized iconography: chariots, spears, boars, tusk helmets, as hints that a warrior aristocracy had indeed arrived. Another picture is quieter. Instead of a dramatic invasion, mainland influence seeps in over generations. Mycenaean families marry into Cretan lineages, perhaps first as honored guests and partners, then as indispensable allies, and finally as leaders. The change in script and language would then reflect an internal decision by an increasingly hybrid elite, adopting the mainland bureaucratic toolkit because it suits their new political reality. A third set of models looks inward. Perhaps Cretan society, already strained by earthquakes, shifting trade, and demographic change, experienced a period of internal instability. Rival factions on the island struggled for control. Some of them may have turned to mainland powers for support. In this view, what we call Mycenaeanization could be the end result of a long internal contest, with one group triumphing that happened to be closely entangled with mainland Greece. Archaeology does not clearly privilege one model. What it does show with more modest confidence are patterns of change in material culture. Ceramics are one of our best indicators. In the later levels at Knossos and other sites, the proportion of pottery in classic Minoan styles rises sharply. Shapes used for drinking and serving, stirrup jars, kylikes, and certain decorated bowls match those found on the mainland. Local motifs persist, but they are increasingly painted in ways that follow mainland fashions. It is as if the tableware of everyday life and the special vessels used in feasting and ritual are slowly being replaced with a new set that carries different visual signals of status and identity. Burial practices shift as well. Earlier, Minoan Crete is notable for communal tombs, caves, house tombs, and later, the beehive, like Thera, where multiple individuals from a community were interred together over generations. In the post-eruption, post-rebuilding phases, more burials appear that resemble mainland elite practices. Individual or small family graves with rich grave goods, weapons, ornate jewelry, and imported items. These changes are not uniform across the island. Some regions show stronger continuity in local traditions. Others swing more sharply toward Mycenaean styles. This unevenness is important. It suggests we are not seeing a single island-wide event, but a patchwork of different experiences. Some communities under direct Mycenaean control, others trading with mainlanders, others still holding more tightly to older ways. Knossos, however, seems to stand out as a node where the mainland pattern takes deepest root. The linear B tablets from there predate many of the archives from mainland palaces. For a time, Knossos may even have functioned as the center of a Mycenaean-style administration, reaching across much of Crete. Lists of sheep and textiles hint at a wide catchment area, with the palace overseeing flocks and workshops scattered through the countryside. This is an odd inversion. For earlier centuries, the flow of influence seemed to go from Crete to the mainland. Minoan art, architecture, and perhaps religious symbols are imitated in Mycenaean contexts. Now in the later Bronze Age, Knossos reads like a Mycenaean palace, transplanted onto Cretan soil, running an economy and bureaucracy that speak Greek on Crete and clay. Before we follow that thread much further, this is a good moment to mention something more modern and practical. The full story behind this episode, along with many of the details and sources, has been expanded into a book. If you find your curiosity waking up, even as your body gets heavy with sleep, that book is available at sleepytimehistory.com. And there happens to be a discount this week. You can always wander back to it tomorrow, when your eyes are a bit less drowsy. Back in the late Bronze Age, the changing of the guard at Knossos would not necessarily have been obvious to everyone living under its shadow. For farmers delivering grain, the officials at the gate might still have spoken in familiar Cretan dialects. The same storage rooms swallowed their sacks. The same courtyards filled at festival times. What changed quietly was the language on the tablets in the back rooms, the origin of certain prestige goods, the styles preferred by those closest to the throne. Power transitions can be like that, bureaucratic rather than spectacular. A different set of names in the archive, new titles for old offices, slightly altered systems of taxation and obligation. When the earth itself is unstable, and when people are used to patching and rebuilding, a shift, from one elite to another, might feel less like revolution and more like just one more adjustment. This is part of why historians remain cautious. There is no carved relief of mainland warriors storming Knossos that we can point to. No royal inscription listing conquered Cretan cities. What we have instead is a collection of clues, Greek written in linear B on Cretan tablets, Mycenaean-style pottery and weapons in Cretan contexts, restructured settlement patterns, and gradual changes in burial and ritual. Taken together, these clues make a Mycenaean presence and likely Mycenaean dominance at Knossos probable. But they do not dictate a single narrative of how that dominance was achieved, or exactly how it premiered on the ground. On some parts of Crete, the old ways of worship, of weaving, of burying the dead, may have continued with only light mainland seasoning. In others, a Mycenaean-speaking elite may have sat quite firmly on top of the social pyramid, redirecting trade, demanding different kinds of service, and tying the island more tightly into a wider iron power structure. By the time the system we call Minoan fades from the archaeological record, what stands in its place is not an empty sea, but a new configuration. Manian palaces, Mycenaean networks, Mycenaean administrators at Knossos and beyond, inheriting much of the infrastructure and knowledge that earlier Cretan builders had created. The civilization that had once set the terms of exchange and style across the Iron had in many ways been absorbed into another. Its palaces, its roots, its scripts, even some of its gods now carried forward under new management, speaking a new language and heading toward a different kind of ending. When Greek speakers of later centuries thought back across the sea, they did not remember any of this in terms of Linear A and Linear B, or shifting percentages of Mycenaean pottery in stratified deposits. They remembered instead a king named Minos. In those stories, Minos rules Crete with a kind of cold brilliance. He commands fleets. He demands tribute from Athens. Every 9 years, according to one version, that tribute takes the form of youths and maidens sent across the water into a building so confusing it might as well be a maze of memory itself, the Labyrinth. Inside waits the Minotaur, a creature part man, part bull, born from a tangle of divine promises and broken oaths. Theseus, the Athenian hero, sails to Crete, descends into the maze, and kills the monster. With help from Minos' daughter, Ariadne, he escapes and sails home again. The tribute ends. Aegean dominance shifts. When archaeologists first uncovered the sprawling ground plan of the palace at Knossos, with its hundreds of rooms, corridors, stairways, and storage complexes wrapped around courts and light wells, it was tempting to see the myth as almost literal. The excavator, Arthur Evans, leaned hard into that connection. He called the complex a Palace of Minos, and saw in its twisting layout the original labyrinth. That picture, like the Theseus story itself, is probably too simple. But the overlap between myth and reality is not random. We know from the archaeological record that long before Athens grew into a classical city-state, Crete hosted large palatial centers, controlled shipping lanes and produced goods, textiles, perfumed oils, elaborate metalwork that moved around the Aegean. From a mainland perspective, especially from smaller or later communities along the Greek coasts, Crete would have seemed like the seat of an older, more established power. It makes sense that memories of that order filtered through centuries of change, earthquakes, eruptions, Mycenaean dominance, and eventual collapse might coalesce around a single named figure who ruled the sea. Minos, in later Greek tradition, is not only a king, he is also in some versions a lawgiver, and even a judge of the dead. Those roles resonate faintly with what we can infer from the tablets and the architecture. A world of formalized rules, repeated procedures, and spaces carefully arranged for receiving, storing, and redistributing goods. A society with an unusually orderly relationship to both land and sea. The labyrinth itself, in myth, is a place of disorientation and danger built by human ingenuity. It traps a monster that must be fed by predictable offerings. Each generation sends its quote of youths who vanish into its complexity. That story, when you set aside the more fantastical elements, feels like an echo of several overlapping realities. There is the physical complexity of places like Knossos, where someone not used to palace life could easily become lost in the repetition of doorways and storerooms. There is the steady drain of resources, grain, textiles, manpower flowing from countryside to center, from smaller communities to one dominant node. There is the experience of sending sons, daughters, and goods away to a distant power whose internal workings are largely opaque. And there is the underlying sense of a system that eventually must be challenged. Oral tradition does not preserve details the way a clay tablet does. It does not give us shipping manifests or precise taxation formulas. What it can carry over long stretches of time are patterns, powerful islands that once demanded tribute, older sea empires that later fell, complex centers that seemed both wonderful and dangerous to those living on their fringes. Those patterns can be recombined, moralized, given new characters and divine motives, but their basic shape remains. One way to think about Minoan in Greek myth is as a composite memory. The reality of early Crete and maritime power, the later experience of Macedonian palaces, the trauma of destructions and abandonments, all mixed together and projected backward into a legendary age of heroes. Archaeology helps us separate some of the strands. It shows that bull imagery was central in Minoan art and ritual long before any written story of a minor. We see bulls in fresco, on seal stones, in small figurines, in the famous scenes of acrobats, apparently leaping over them. We find constructed courtyards and extended processional spaces where large gatherings could take place, perhaps linked to such performances. We also see that Minoan palaces were not prisons. Their storage wings, workshops, and audience halls point more toward economic and religious centrality than toward anything like a dungeon. At the same time, archaeology cannot tell us what people called these places. It cannot confirm whether any historical Minos ever lived, or whether Athenians of the Bronze Age really sent regular tribute to Crete. It cannot reconstruct the stories whispered by sailors as they rounded Crete and capes at night. What it can clarify are the more durable contributions that outlasted the palaces themselves. Minoan art, for instance, leaves a long shadow. The fluid lines, the love of natural motifs, spirals, shells, lilies, marine creatures, the delicate, almost weightless human figures. These become reference points for later iron styles. Mysian wall painting absorbs and adapts Minoan themes. Even centuries after the palace's fall, Greek artists retain a sense that Crete and the older Aegean held an ancestry of image and symbol. In seafaring, the networks first fully articulated under Minoan palatial systems do not vanish with their political control. Routes to the Cyclades, to the Doconesses, to the coasts of Anatolia and beyond remain in use. Harbors improved during the Mino, and zenith continue to matter in Macedonian, then in later Greek, horizons. The idea that the sea is not just a barrier, but a structured space of repeating journeys of schedules, cargoes, expectations, is part of the mental world that later Greek sailors inherit. Administratively, the Minoans seem to have pioneered, at least in this corner of the world, a dense, document-the-heavy way of running things. They used seals and sealings to control access and track movement. They stored information on clay in a script that remains closed to us. Mycenaean elites adopt much of that apparatus, shifting the language, but keeping the basic toolkit. Later Greek city-states will not copy the clay tablets directly, but the notion that complex societies rest on records, accounts, and standardized procedures has its local roots here. Even religiously, there are suggestive continuities. Certain goddesses and symbols that appear in Minoan contexts, ladies with raised arms, sacred trees, double axes, find faint reflections in later cult images and attributes. Not as one-tune survivals, but as elements in a shared symbolic vocabulary that Greek religion reworks. All of this means that when classical Greeks looked out across the water and told stories about Moses and Theseus, they were not inventing a vanished world from nothing. They were standing on a stage, partly built by the people we call Minoans, surrounded by echoes of their choices in art, trade, and governance. The stones under their temples had sometimes once been parts of older structures. The roots of their merchant ships traced paths, first knit tightly together in the Bronze Age. The very idea of a great palace on Crete, filled with treasures and secrets, was already old by the time Homer singers began to imagine it. Yet for all that we can trace, a great deal remains just beyond our reach. we still cannot read Linear A, the primary script of the Minoan palaces. Without it, their own words about themselves, their lists and dedications, and perhaps their myths remain silent. We do not know what they called their gods, their rulers, their islands. We do not know how they told the story of the great eruption, or how they understood the earthquakes that shattered their walls. We can see their ships in miniature, carved on seals or painted on walls, but we do not know what songs their sailors sang. We can reconstruct their drinking cups and ritual vessels, but we do not know the full shape of the rituals they serve. In that sense, the Minoan world has become a kind of labyrinth for us. We move through corridors of evidence, architecture, pottery, fresco fragments, exported objects guided by small lights from later myths and texts. Sometimes the paths seem to meet, and a figure like Minos takes on sharper outline for a moment. Then the passage curves again, and we are back among silent storerooms. What survived of this sea empire lives in several layers at once. In the physical remains buried under fields and modern towns, in the artistic and institutional habits taken up by their Macedonian successors, and in the stories that later Greeks told about a powerful island kingdom ruled by a demanding king and haunted by a monster in a maze. Each layer preserves something true and alters something else, and somewhere behind them, all beyond the reach of our current scripts and shads, there were real people moving through these palaces and harbors, thinking their own thoughts, telling their own stories about why things were as they were. For now, their voices stay mostly under the surface. The sea that once carried their ships has carried away many of their words, but the outlines of their world still ripple through ours, inviting us quietly to keep listening. By the time we first talked about Crete in this story, the high days of its sea empire were already in the past. If you trace the arc back in your mind now, you can feel how much fits into that quiet phrase. Before Greece, there was a scattered world of islands and coasts stitched together by small boats, sightlines and memory. There were early farms and fishing grounds, shrines on hilltops, and sheltered coves that slowly turned into harbors. Then, on that loose fabric tightened, palaces rose, storage magazines filled, administrators tallied grain and oil on clay. Ships came and went in predictable rhythms, bearing copper, tin, wine, textiles, and stories. For a while, this was one of the most structured maritime worlds the planet had ever seen. Then, far to the north in the Aegean, a volcano began to stir. Pressure built beneath the magma rose. Gas escaped. People went on with their lives. They planted, traded, repaired hulls, lit lamps, and then the sequence we call the eruption unfolded in stages. Earthquakes, ash, collapse, an emptying of the caldera, great waves racing outward. What followed was not a single clean break. It was a long, uneven unwinding. Some ports were buried, others merely choked for a season. Some sea routes shifted slightly, others snapped. Certain communities seemed to have recovered quickly, or even profited by filling gaps. Others entered slow decline, never quite regaining their old rhythms. On Crete itself, palaces were damaged, rebuilt, transformed. The Mycenaeans came first as trading partners, then as power holders, speaking a different language, but using many of the same tools. When we step back, it is tempting to let the volcano do all the work in our explanations. A single great catastrophe, a vanished civilization. The story fits neatly in a single breath. But the farther archaeologists dig, and the more precisely they date layers, the messier and more interesting the picture becomes. The eruption was massive, and its impacts were real. Yet, it was only one element threaded among many. Local earthquakes before and after, long-term climate shifts, changes in trade routes as new regions rose to prominence, internal social tensions, perhaps outbreaks of disease. Some farmers might have experienced it as a sudden disaster. Others, hundreds of kilometers away, might have registered it only as a strange red dawn or a season of poor sailing. There was no single day when someone blew out a lamp in Knossos, shut a palace door, and ended Minoan civilization. Instead, there were years of adjustment, decades of rebuilding and rebalancing, and then centuries in which the old forms, labyrinthine palaces, linear tablets, delicate wall paintings of blue dolphins, slowly gave way to different arrangements of stone, clay, and story. Maritime power shifted north and west. The languages carved into clay changed. New heroes entered the tales sung at night. What we can see most clearly in the archaeological record are the turning points where something breaks, burns, or is abandoned. What we feel less sharply are the long, soft transitions. Children who grow up taking new rulers for granted. Sailors who still use old Crete and harbors, but now answer to mainland chiefs. Artisans who copy Minoan motifs one last time before adopting different tastes. From our distance with the luxury of hindsight and aerial maps, it is easy to think in terms of rise and fall. For the people living through it, the end of this sea empire was probably a slow fade, full of continuities that made change feel bearable. And even now the outlines are not fixed. Each new survey in the circles, each underwater discovery off a Cretan bay, each fragment of wall painting carefully lifted from a collapsed room adds or subtracts something from the story. Radio-Arbon dates are recalibrated. Pollen cores from ancient lakes refine our sense of climate. Some long-held sequences are quietly revised. Others gain firmer footing. The picture you have been drifting through in this episode is not finished. It is a work in progress, assembled from sherds, cores, and cautious inferences. A map drawn in pencil, always ready for new lines. If you're still awake, or hovering in that soft place between waking and sleep, and you'd like to help this kind of long-form, unrushed history keep going, you can gently tap, like or subscribe, or leave a comment. It genuinely helps more than it seems to, in the same way that a small harbor used consistently can turn into a major port over time. If you feel like sharing, you can also tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. A late night in a city, an early morning by the sea, a quiet afternoon somewhere inland. Over time, those little notes make their own kind of map, a network of modern listeners echoing distantly, the old iron web of islands and routes.